So welcome. Thank you all for coming, particularly at the last slot, the last day of the conference. I'm Steve Schwartzman. I'm Director of Tropical Forest Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I think we have a really terrific panel for you all today on enhancing forestry's contribution to combating climate change. So I'm just going to make a couple observations, introduce our distinguished panel, and we can get started. Forests are extremely important to the future of the atmosphere of this planet, and I think there's a lot of ways that we can see that. One of them is that it is still the case that the largest single contribution that any nation has made to reducing greenhouse gas emissions is Brazil's success in reducing Amazon deforestation, principally between 2004 and 2012. And this, in spite of what people, or the impression you might take away from kind of media reports more recently about increases in deforestation, which is true, it remains the case that Brazil made a huge reduction in emissions, which hasn't been reversed. At the same time, it was growing its agricultural economy substantially. Deforestation went down over 80% between 2004 and 2012. Since then, it's gone up a bit, but it's essentially oscillated between about 5 and 8,000 square kilometers a year, as opposed to having been up around 27,000 before. And there's a whole series of reasons I won't go into here why we could have expected that that these gains could have been reversed. So they're really very robust, and I think that's important. It's worth understanding and worth recognizing that, in fact, it is possible to preserve forests on a very large scale while growing a dynamic agricultural economy at the same time, although these gains are really increasingly at risk in Brazil and, of course, elsewhere. I think the big change in how we think about these issues that's come about in the past maybe 3, 4, 5 years that I think our panelists are really going to help illuminate for us is in the way that people think about the role of forests in climate equilibrium and how the carbon accounting associated with forests. Kind of gotten past the methodology that the IPCC and others used to use until fairly recently, where they looked at gross emissions from deforestation, and netted out all of the additions, the sinks from regeneration and reforestation, and came up with a relatively modest-looking contributions on net basis for deforestation. But more recently, work of Ski Houghton and others, and I think the Natural Climate Change Solutions article that some of our panelists worked on here was a kind of a logical progression to that, has shown that really, if you look at gross deforestation and then the sink potential or the actual sink contribution of forests that are regenerating in the tropics and elsewhere, and their potential with a whole series of ways, through improved forest management, through restoration, through reforestation, through enhancement of soil carbons and so on. The potential for forests to contribute to the world making a 1.5 or 2 degree target is really much greater than had been thought before. Perhaps as much as a third of the mitigation that we need to be able to make that target. So, like I said, we have a really terrific panel here today, and I'll just briefly introduce them. David Shoch is a forester. He's worked with Windrock, the Nature Conservancy, is now with TerraCarbon, and has done forest carbon projects all over the world. Peter Ellis is a forest carbon scientist with the Nature Conservancy, has worked extensively on forest carbon impacts from various land uses in Indonesia, but again, all around the world, and is also one of the co-authors of the Nature Climate Change article, Natural Climate Solutions, which has generated a lot of attention, has made some really important contributions to the discussion. Bettina Van Hagen helped launch Ecotrust Forests and then joined Ecotrust Forest Management as CEO in 2008. She came out of the financial sector, has 20 years of experience in banking, impact investing, fund management, and then for the last 15 years, she's been working on forestry, the health of forest ecosystems, and forest economies in the Pacific Northwest. So, without further ado, you want to start?
Off, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the introduction. It's really great to be here. So as Steve's already sort of given a bit of the framing, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the highest level of what the science says around natural climate solutions. So the secret's out here, but the secret is that there is this extremely powerful technology that's going to allow us to face the greatest challenge of our generation, which is combating climate change. It's not a new technology. The technology's been around for about 3.5 billion years, so it's very well vetted. You don't have to worry about it, whether it works or not. It actually self-replicates across most of the globe already. It's called photosynthesis, and it actually sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores it in really useful things like wood products. And so that's what we mean when we talk about natural climate solutions. Let me just give you a quick sense of the numbers here. And this is from this paper that Steve mentioned, Natural Climate Solutions and Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, came about 2 years ago. I won't go into great detail, but the point here is that nature goes to 11. For the Spinal Tap fans here, maybe you know the reference. We've got about 11 years to go to 11. Notice that if on the globe there, we do need to make really important advances in clean energy, and that's a really important part of the solution, but what gets only a small amount of the attention, but is a third of the solution in order to meet the Paris Agreement in the next 11 years, is changes to the way we manage our land base and steward natural ecosystems. And that together can deliver 11 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. I'm happy to talk more about this, but if people want to have questions, but we're going to dive more into the practicality and into actual interventions on the ground, because that's what we need to do now. And this is the advantage of natural climate solutions, is they can deliver negative emissions and avoided emissions immediately. If you have any interest in this, there's lots of materials up here. Come on up and grab some. So diving in, we're going to focus primarily on improved forest management and a little bit maybe about reforestation in the forest sector as a natural climate solution. We're going to talk about projects both, or our understanding of that potential as a particularly low-cost, low-hanging fruit natural climate solution available now across the United States, and another paper that David and I also published that takes these results and makes them valid within the lower 48 in particular. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on reduced impact logging in the tropics as another really low-cost, valuable natural climate solution, and Bettina will talk about some of her work in the Pacific Northwest in forestry. So David, do you want to take it from there?
So that's a good sort of introduction to the scope of the opportunity out there. Peter was talking about referencing the global paper that was published a few years ago. More recent paper published this last fall in Science Advances, Joe Fargione was the lead author, did the same analysis at the U.S. level. And these values up here on this chart are those in green: deforestation, improved forest management, avoided conversion of forests. On the x-axis, those are billion tons of CO2 equivalent emission ways, and those are annual. And one of the key things that we wanted to discuss here are the limitations in current carbon markets in achieving the raw potential out there on the landscape. And that's my point in bringing this slide here, is that if you look in orange, those values are the total emission reductions in the same units achieved through the voluntary and compliance markets through 2018. And so those aren't annuals. That's the total cumulative amount achieved from roughly 2006 to 2018. So first off, it's a pittance of what the raw potential out there in the landscape is. And especially importantly is the sort of the discrepancy between the distributions there. Look at reforestation in particular. How much has the voluntary and compliance markets achieved in terms of reforestation in the U.S. compared to what the raw potential is? Almost nothing. And we'll get into that. What are the particular challenges and what are the potential solutions to some of these issues? But I wanted to draw attention to that. These are some clear limitations of the carbon market, and we need to figure out how to make it work.
I want to bring us from the global to our neighbor to the north, the state of Oregon. So the solution globally could be, that forest could be a third of our solution. In Oregon, I'm going to argue that it should not be, but it could be our total solution. And I just want to sort of bring home how important forests are as part of the solution. And not just forests in terms of their importance for carbon, but really forests thinking about the whole broad range of things that forests can provide us. So it's not just about carbon, it's about timber, it's about home building, it's about new technologies that we can do with wood, it's about biodiversity, water, recreation, sort of the full spectrum of goods and services that forests can play. And a climate-smart forest strategy can actually enhance the delivery of most of those or all of those. And so I just want to first just note how significant forests can be as both a source of emissions and a source of sequestration. So in Oregon, this is a study that was done by the Oregon Global Warming Commission in 2017. And what the chart shows is the sources of emissions that had been assessed to date. So you have transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and agriculture. And all of those sources that have been tracked to date accounted for about 60 million metric tons on an annual basis. And the big surprise for me, I don't know if any of you were surprised as well, is that the forest sector alone was contributing also 60 million tons in terms of emissions. And this is just in forest emissions, so this is not accounting for processing and transportation, and nor is it accounting for wood storage and building products and all the rest of it. This is just in forest assessment. So the amount of contribution from the forest sector, and this is primarily from harvesting mortality, is as great as all of those other sectors. So that was a big sort of mind blower. But the other side of forests, of course, is they could be a source of emissions from harvesting mortality and fire, but they can also be a source of sequestration. So what this is illustrating is that the forest sector, over the period studied, actually sequestered 88 million tons. So it covered all of the emissions of the forest sector plus half of the emissions of all the other sectors as well. So Oregon net, for those sectors that were assessed, including forestry, was a net emitter of 30 million tons. So that was the potential of forestry in an environment in which carbon wasn't really being considered. And so what those downward arrows are suggesting is that if we actually considered carbon, if we actually priced carbon, which I hope we're about to do in Oregon very soon, and we deliberately manage for carbon, that forest carbon can actually cover all of the emissions in Oregon. And actually what we are hoping, the aspiration here, is that they can lead us to drawdown. And drawdown, of course, is the reduction of net emissions in the atmosphere, which I think is the the thing that we all want. And obviously that includes both reducing emissions from the other sectors and increasing the sequestration of forests. And the one thing I'll say about, every forest system is unique. The beautiful thing about the forests on the West Coast is that most of these species like to be old. Right now, the harvesting age is many forests, between 35 and 45 years old. Depends a little bit on site class. But these forests grow productively and happily into age 50, 60, 70, 80. I got to be careful. There's a lot of foresters in the room with me, so they're all nodding. And beyond. And the potential here is that we increase the carbon stored in forests, and then we can continue during that period of time, and then once they achieve that carbon storage, to resume harvesting, and they can continue to be the great source of timber for housing and for other uses that they are currently. And so with this sort of image in mind, we launched a company in 2004 to basically implement this style of climate smart forestry. And the idea really is that you end up with more. If you're managing forests for the whole array of products and services, and you're using carbon and other markets to monetize the benefits from carbon storage, habitat, water protection, rural job creation, recreation, and scenic values and all the rest of it, that you actually, from a private perspective, can generate more value from your investors, and from a public perspective, you're significantly increasing the contribution of forests to societal well-being. So this is the strategy that we've been pursuing, and it just the stacked bar chart there just shows a timber-only strategy in which your only investment benefits are from the sale of timber and the capital appreciation of that timber, versus a strategy where you're actively managing for habitat, water, carbon, and job creation, and monetizing those streams and generating a much more valuable resource. And I think the point is in a constrained world, no matter what the resource, whether it be forests or oceans or deserts or cities or buses, we have to start thinking in this perspective of you're really managing for this full array of resources, both public and private. And that's the way I think that we will be able to move forward. And so I just want to share a little bit about what that actually looks like on the ground. So we've developed sort of our 5 R's of climate smart forestry. We talked a little bit about the first one, which is about rotation, which is increasing the time from when a tree is planted or seeds naturally to the time it is harvested. And the rotation age is, of course, very closely correlated to the carbon stored and also to the quality of wood delivered. Retention. Currently in Oregon, the industry can do a clear cut of 120 acres with pretty few trees, 3 trees per acre, left behind. Retention is retaining 10 to 30% of trees in the harvest area, not only for carbon, but also for habitat, water protection, seed source, and a variety of other factors. Reserves is protecting those special areas of the forest that might have unique habitat, especially riparian forests that are the birthplace and graveyard of iconic Pacific salmon. Restoration and relationships, perhaps we can talk about later, but those are the primary drivers of carbon storage. And so just to note that these are strategies that are currently being implemented, and if the whole our forest management over the time period that we've been doing it has been resulting in 50 to 80% increased carbon storage. And so the thought there is, I think if industry could implement this more broadly, then I think we could start seeing the type of pictures we were seeing before in terms of the kind of role that forests can play in addressing climate change in Oregon and beyond.
Back to you, David.
So, back to some of the challenges, and one of the challenges that is invariably occurs on projects is the challenge of scale. And I was hoping, Bettina, that you might make mention of the Ecotrust is also developing an aggregated project on the voluntary market. It's an improved forest management project that's accounting the climate impacts, the climate mitigation impacts of that project. But it's also capturing economies of scale by it's working under a mechanism that allows it to grow over time, and those predominantly fixed costs of project development can be spread across a larger area and improve the sort of financial outcome of it. That's one of the solutions that are currently being sort of engineered in the carbon market to allow these projects to be viable. But in terms of what we've achieved so far, we still have a long ways to go. What I want to show in this graph here is in green, it's the National Woodland Owner Survey. It's a U.S. Forest Service periodic survey of family forest owners in the United States. The most recent one was in 2013. And this is the distribution of parcel sizes across that ownership class across the total United States. And these are all as percentage of total acres. So those green bars are the percentage of the total families in those different classes. And you can see it's mostly skewed to the smaller areas. Yes, you have some larger properties, but most of it is parcels. The almost exact opposite distribution is to be seen in the carbon market. So looking across all registered compliance and voluntary projects to date, we looked across all the registries recently. Those projects you can see in orange. Those are the percentage of total acres of the total set of registered projects. And they're all out there, way out there on the end, greater than 5,000 acres. And Bettina reminded me this morning, we looked at these slides together, she's like, don't think if you've got 5,000 acres that's enough, because it's not. Most of those projects are 10,000 plus, and many of them tens of thousands of acres. So there's this great area that is essentially off limits to the carbon market. These landowners have not been able to access that. And so one of the big challenges and one of the things we need to find out is how do we reach down to these smaller holders? And that could be through aggregation approaches and through some different approaches. We'll talk a little later on, an initiative that's being developed by the Nature Conservancy and by the American Forest Foundation. It's called the Family Forest Carbon Program. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but it's really directed to reach that subset of landowners that currently don't have access to carbon markets. Flip it to the next. And the reason that is, and I just want to show this slide just to see why the issue of scale. And here we've got project area. So this is you can think of parcels. Now, the bigger your area, you're able to spread those across more acres. The dollars per acre goes down. This is for an improved forest management project. It's going to generate, on average, at this point down here. And so you look at that, you draw this line up, and this is 2,000 family forest ownerships in these assessments that have been done.
Actually, I'm going to go back here since I totally missed my cue last time on this. So I just wanted to note, this value creation chart that we have, and one is a timber-only strategy, and one is a strategy we're employing of basically monetizing this whole suite of values. And you look at this and go like, okay, well that sounds cool. Like you're creating more value. Why doesn't everybody just do that? And I will say that this is a bit of the carbon portion of this. If I actually just had carbon and not easements, you wouldn't even see it. It's so small. I think because of these, that's the lead in I should have done, because of these sort of high friction costs. But I think there's another element I wanted to talk about as well, which is it's all about the net value to the landowner. So it's about the price of carbon, and it's about these friction costs, which you were referring to. And so the price of carbon, in our analysis for our type of forest is going to vary. It's really somewhere between $30 and $100 a ton. I mean, that's the price that's needed, absent the friction costs, to really be able to develop a carbon project successfully. So part of the reason we're not seeing it on the landscape is the price is just too bloody low and the friction costs are too high. And I think so what we do is, we analyze every stand. And the beautiful thing about carbon relative to timber, in terms of having both of those as optional ways to monetize timber, is that if you're managing for timber, you want it to be on, flat, where you're doing shovel logging, where your logging costs are low, where your haul costs are low, where your reforestation costs are low. And carbon, on the other hand, is indifferent to the topography. So it's really beautiful to have that type of optionality where on places that are hard to access or steep or have other high values, you can really be managing that for carbon. And that's why forests are so beautiful in that respect. If a landowner really had all of that optionality, you could imagine them with a higher carbon price or lower friction costs, or hopefully both, being able to really begin to manage for that transition and to slowly increase the amount of carbon stored in longer rotations while still servicing the needs we all have for wood. So just wanted to make sure that we captured both ends of that. The price in Norway, I just learned from Corinna, is $60 a ton. That would be sweet. And I think that you would then begin to see the type of potential in switching that I think we all, imagine for this sector. So wanted to bring that point in as well. So back to the slide I should now be on. This is one of our projects in Moss Creek. And I think this is sort of how you can imagine, forest carbon projects playing out, if you could get the pricing right, is that you really have forests are living systems. You have incredible variety in both in terms of their ecological significance and their economic significance and their social significance. And the optionality of being able to manage either for carbon or for timber, or for habitat or other values, would really, I think, create a really cost-effective way of achieving carbon sequestration and emission reductions in a way that would really, I think, serve the public interest. And so our projects are on the small end, and we have been able to use this sort of strategy of having instances of a project to reduce the costs. But in general, our observation of the market, and I know we have some market experts in the room that can corroborate this, is that the forest carbon uptake that we've been seeing has really been either very large landowners with very modest costs, with modest costs, per acre because of their scale, or landowners that are being rewarded for past practices that are able to get an immediate payment for past carbon that has been accumulated. But really, I think if we want to see this as a trigger for behavior, we're going to have to either address or hopefully address both the friction costs and the carbon price. And I think that if you did that, you would see an amazing uptake that would be beautiful not only in terms of its climate solution, but also beautiful in terms of its biodiversity and habitat solutions, because these are forests, of course, that are home to Pacific salmon and marble murrelets and whole hundreds and hundreds of species of forest-dependent species that would benefit from this, especially us. We know about 40% of our water comes from forested watersheds as well. So all of the co-benefits that would come from this strategy are not even being priced into that, and quite significant.
So, just sort of reemphasizing that we are operating at an order of magnitude lower than Norway in carbon pricing is the reality, right? Would you say $6 a ton is about more or less where we're at on the voluntary market, David? And you said 60 pricing at. So we all know that that's where we need to go, right? That's the only way we're going to solve this problem is if we put a price on carbon that actually deals with this issue. But in the meantime, what are some of the cheapest natural climate solutions that we can operate at given the prices things are at right now? And so this is one that we've done a lot of research on at the Nature Conservancy, and David's been very involved in this as well. In the tropics, we're looking into expanding this into the Central Appalachians region and other parts of the U.S. as well. We call it Reduced Impact Logging for Climate Change Mitigation, which is just a very long acronym we call RILC for smart logging, basically, and that smart logging saves trees. It's not rocket science, simple ideas. You reduce wood waste. When you cut a tree down, you should use that wood. Around 50% of the trees that got cut down in many of the logging concessions we assessed across our sample of this research were left in the forest just because there wasn't communication between the skidder and the feller, or various other reasons the trees were hollow. As you can see here in the particular example, they fell a hollow tree and they don't discover it's hollow until after they fell it. That tree doesn't have enough value for it to be able to get out to the road, so it's left there to rot. They could have tested to see if it was hollow before they cut it down with a chainsaw and saved all that biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and carbon for the future. Better bucking, simple efficiencies that should be part of business practices in general for a lot of these logging operations, minimizing your hauling footprint. A lot of the time in these tropical countries, they have to build out their logging roads 30, 40, 50 meters in width in order to dry them out well enough so they can get the logs out. If they use better practices for using gravel and other drainage techniques, they can make their roads much narrower. These are just examples of the kinds of things we can do. We recently published a special issue of Forest Ecology and Management with 7 papers that reviewed this across 7 different countries and showed that if we put all of these things together in one place, we could reduce the emissions from selective logging in the tropics by half. We could half the carbon emissions. That would generate about 4% of the climate mitigation needed to get to the Climate Paris Agreement. That doesn't sound like a lot, but again, we're looking for the lowest hanging fruit here. And the big news is this is leakage free, right? We could do this stuff without impacting our timber production because you're just talking about collateral damage you're getting the same amount of wood out, but you're actually reducing your emissions. So this is more information if you're interested in it. This is something that we'd like to see operating as soon as possible. The barriers to implementation partly are cost. We need to have incentives go to these operators to actually be able to do the few extra things they need to, but more about training, more about culture, and so that's where we want to try and focus our efforts in the near term, knowing that we need to get to these higher carbon prices as well if we want to revolutionize and get the mitigation we need. So
maybe I could jump in here and
Yeah, I think
ask a couple questions to the panelists before we open it up to the audience. And one, you've kind of gotten at this issue, all of you at different levels, but maybe we could focus in a little bit more and try and sort of tease out the question of what really specifically needs to happen to make these kinds of solutions viable. You made, I think, a terrific case that there are technical solutions for lower impact logging that would have huge consequences. Well, I can kind of guess why they're not happening now in certain places, but how do you see it becoming feasible? And similarly, I think you actually did lay out some of the reasons, but just maybe looking at what are the kind of 2 or 3 most important things that need to happen to make it viable to adopt those better practices that'll pay better returns while they are treating the ecosystems, including the carbon, better. And similarly, on the national level, what specifically needs to happen to make this stuff more viable, politically, economically?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think there's a simple answer. I'll start just with a specific example of reduced impact logging. I think what we're discovering, we've got the science pretty well established for this now, so it's not an information problem or a measurement problem. It's more about implementation. And what we're discovering is that there is no simple answer, right? It's not just about training people. It's not just about getting governments to buy into this. It's both. You need to have both top-down and bottom-up work in tandem to actually figure out how to implement these things. We're working with the government of Gabon right now, who intends to use this methodology as 85% of their way to get to their NDC. They're going 100% FSC certified by 2022, and they want to build this into that process. So that's a really cool top-down effort that hopefully will have big impacts. But at the same time, we need to actually train those loggers to implement the improved practices themselves through a bottom-up approach. Or in Mexico, we're working with community-based forest managers to help them access new markets through getting price premiums through FSC's ecosystem service claims, which is a new part of FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, that allows existing certificate holders to make claims on carbon and other ecosystem services. So those are just some examples, but I think it's an important question, and there isn't a simple answer to it. It's a variety of different actions from top down and bottom up.
I think, in the U.S. and the Pacific Northwest, which I know best, I think a lot of the tools are already in place. So, we're looking at passing House Bill 2020 in Oregon, which will create a cap and invest market in Oregon following the great leadership of California. And, still, I think, negotiating what role forest offsets will play in that system. So even if you have a trade cap and invest system, then there's all sorts of questions about how much you will allow in offsets, how much of that, really what the market demand is going to be for that. The other thing that California is doing, which is really exciting, is how then, and Oregon is looking at the same thing, how you then deploy your auction revenues from the sale of allowances. So that's been a really delicious way to sort of get away from the friction costs of carbon, is to use auction revenues, to advance a working forest easement that accomplishes many of the same goals potentially around carbon storage, that a carbon mechanism might. So you can design those types of mechanisms as well, which gets away from the friction costs. But really, I think it's the mechanisms are in place. It's just, the price is too low and the friction costs are too high. And I think that, we were having a chat earlier today about the different mechanisms that could be done. One of the main friction costs for forest landowners, the most painful thing, is boots on the ground forest carbon inventories. Hugely painful, hugely slow, hugely expensive. And finding some strategies to address those inventory costs is one of the primary components of these friction costs. And I won't randomly throw out some of the ideas that we had because they might be a little bit too exciting for some of you. So we might have a private discussion on that later. But I think that would be that's the mechanism. And then it's just. It's just pretty simple. I think that people will respond to. I think the role of government and policymakers is to set the adequate incentives in place, and the role of the private sector is to respond to them. And right now, there's not enough juice to respond to, and so the only crazies that are willing to play in forest carbon right now are either those that are sitting on a forest carbon inventory that they can monetize quickly, or idiots like our company that are just so passionate about it that we will put in, endless sweat to try to make one of these projects happen. And that's not going to make a market work. It has to be the easier thing to do, is to do a forest carbon strategy. So, it's all there. It's just in the pricing.
If I could just follow on with what you said, Bettina, like coming from an inventory forester, which is my job, we measure too much. And if we could direct more of that money to actually putting the practices in place, that would be a great achievement. And I really like the allowance system that California is implementing, because it's not dependent on what the outcomes are. The focus is not necessarily on coming up with very precise estimates of what those impacts are, but it's about paying for the practice. And there are a wide range of practices that have positive climate impacts out there that the current prices in the carbon market are not going to pay for. And it's different initiatives like that where you're not creating an asset necessarily, but you're putting the money down that needs that the practice demands, and estimating what the impact is with accurate, known precision, but not having the same expectations in terms of precision that we do on the carbon market. We got to hit those error bars. We got to nail it, right? I don't think that's always necessary. I think we measure too much.
Great. Well, thank you all. So why don't we open it up to questions from the audience?
Assessments.
We do now. I think everyone in this field uses a combination of ground truthing and remote sensing. I think we could do a better job. I think we could as remote sensing gets better, we can optimize and minimize the amount of groundwork. But we're never going to get to the point where remote sensing is the sole solution.
What if you had like the Soil Conservation Service, who had wall-to-wall mapping of net primary production? You can do that by remote sensing.
So you can, but for a lot of these, let me just speak about this specific example with reduced impact logging. You're talking about a 15% change in stocks in an ecosystem that could be 200 tons of carbon per hectare. That is, I remain unconvinced that remote sensing has the technology available to be able to detect those types of changes. And now you're talking about making manipulations to that, reducing that even further. So I think for deforestation, reforestation, a lot of other interventions, remote sensing is very powerful. And I do a lot of remote sensing, so I totally agree. That's going to be one way we have to reduce our costs. But for some particular natural climate solutions, the technology is not there yet, and we need, and you never can get away from the fact that you need to calibrate your remote sensing with good ground data. So what we're trying to do is think innovatively, and David's been part of this, and Bettina has already mentioned her secret sort of little strategies for making things cheaper. How can we use existing field data and be deployed in such a way that we're being very efficient? Set baselines at regional levels, measure performance using proxy indicators, look at tie the actual performance to the implementation of the practices themselves rather than measuring the carbon, and other creative ideas for making these things cheaper to measure. Because I completely agree with David. We need to measure less, or measure just as much as we need to be confident that you're getting a positive climate outcome from this.
But technology is not going to be the only solution to this. I mean, that's not the main. It may, I don't know, in some circumstances it may be the main constraint, but there's a lot of process-based constraints in the way that methodologies are done, the way that projects get registered and verified that could be simplified, I would say.
Right.
And those are things that aren't addressed by technology. There are things that are going to be addressed by the standards that are implementing them.
So we spoke earlier about aggregation, and I would love to hear how do you guys imagine this aggregation of smaller landowners could happen? What are the blockers? And is new protocols or is new techniques? How do you imagine that?
Yeah, so one of the solutions that the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation are currently working on, and it's very similar to California's allowance systems, the Family Forest Carbon Program, and it's a practice-based system. It does not award incentives on the basis of outcomes. It awards incentives on the basis of practices put in place. And so it's an example of we're going to direct the money to getting work done on the ground and spend less attention on measuring what the outcomes are. These are all practices that have unambiguous positive carbon impacts, and we can basically estimate what those benefits are with a known degree of uncertainty, but have a wider allowance for what that uncertainty is, because this program is not intended to produce an asset, and like an actual commodity metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And I think that's freeing it up to come up with a more practice-based approach with sort of wider latitude around what the uncertainty is in terms of reporting. The other beauty of that is that the payments are focused on what does it cost to put that practice in place, not what is the cost, what is the price of a ton of carbon. And so it's a more accurate reflection of what it takes to do something with a positive impact. I think I've been doing carbon projects for 20 years, and I'm pretty excited for the past few years because I really think there's a lot of people out there starting to rethink how this can be done and looking at where the carbon market has fallen short and what are some kind of new approaches to fill those gaps. And part of it is also sort of creating these not markets, but these sort of alternative mechanisms that aren't producing an asset. Maybe you might even say, oh, well, that's just philanthropy, but it's potentially generating new money that wasn't being directed toward conservation and climate impacts. That's a long answer. The revenue source it's a pilot initiative that's going into practice this year. It's being piloted in Northern California and in the Central Appalachians, and the revenue source is corporations that are paying for the pilot initiative. Eventually, the hope is that this will become some sort of public-private, that these can be worked into potentially state initiatives and find a way that public and private dollars can fund these kind of things in a very similar way to how the California allowance money is. I think that the thing that needs, and this isn't in my field at all, but like how you would develop something like that where private money could work together with public money to expand the amount of funding available. And the private money, I think, is going to be incentivized by, those donors, those investors, at least being able to sort of claim, what those impacts are, short of them being actual tons of CO2, emission reduction, like credits.
So there's another question there in the back.
Yeah, Jason Coe with the U.S. Forest Service, and thanks for your presentations. I was wondering, kind of like both either global, national, or at a state level, if within that large band of potential for natural solutions, if there have been attempts to kind of parcel that out between kind of like, I mean, understanding again, it was interesting, thinking about like the costs depend on how you're going to achieve that, right? So if you're attributing it through a market or a voluntary, way, that's going to be a very different cost than say like doing it through a conservation easement like CAL FIRE has done. But like I was wondering if there was some sort of way to differentiate between the relative costs of achieving that potential within that large 33%. That's the one that stuck in my mind. And if there's a way to kind of then think about how to break that out in different ways
So I can just speak to the global paper here where we tried to do that in very coarse terms. A lot of work needs to be done, but what I will say is we hope that this natural climate solutions framework is useful to people not only as a way to add up to 11, but we thought very carefully about making sure there wasn't double counting going on in here and that each of these different pathways that you see laid out here can operate independently and add up to 11 and have real interventions on the ground that are activities that are components of this. So for each pathway, we actually did estimate the cost very coarsely so that we could, and that 11 is actually cost adjusted. What we did is we started with an understanding what the maximum potential was, biophysical. If you reforested all the available land that could be forest, how much land and how much carbon do you get? Obviously, we're not going to do that, but then take it back and understand on very rough terms, how much does that cost? And then use that as a way to create ambition parity between different pathways when you get there. So I'd recommend, I can give you a copy of this if you want, where we try to get at that issue. If I'm understanding your question correctly, looking at the cost of different types of interventions has been into different possibilities.
Yeah, there's like feasibility to achieve one versus the other as compared to say not having maybe especially in the market.
That 11, the cost on that is set at about $100 a ton, which is what we estimate is needed. We need to pay as a global civilization to get to stay below 2 degrees. Any other comments from? There's no cost in this graph. It's just carbon. But there's another graph that has costs in it that I can give you.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry, but are you interested in the relative cost of each one of those interventions?
Yes. Come find me afterwards and we can talk through this.
They are detailed in the paper. Yeah.
I would just say that answering that question at a very different scale. I think one of the beauties of forests is that you do have this diversity of trade-off prices, between, for example, timber, which is the current use, and carbon. And so across our portfolio, for example, there can be some stands where the switching cost from timber and carbon is as low as $25, and there's other places where the switching cost is as high as $200. And so what would be interesting to do is is to get a stratification of. I think that anytime you have a forest, the challenge is for a timber landowner. They have forests where there's land that is super steep, super important habitat, but the only way that you can monetize that is to cut it down, where really the timber harvesting costs are very high. And in those cases, the carbon switching cost is quite low. And so, there is a whole variety. There's not a single price that which people will switch. But I think once you start getting $16 is too low. $6 is definitely too low. But I think once you start getting into the mid-20s, you're going to start seeing some switching behavior. And then that will, continue to intensify. And I'm not sure that, I don't know, John, whether you have done more analysis on sort of what that switching price is in different forest types, or if you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't think about it from a switching perspective. I think about it from a prolonging the rotation, so not a complete switch. And then
Sure.
forcing landowners to harvest perhaps what might be the lesser economic choice. So it's a similar idea, but
Right.
prolonging the harvest. And I think that really has to vary by the value of the timber, and there's a lot of variables there.
Yep.
The more money that we have, the more valuable the carbon ton is, the more we can do, we can improve management value.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. How do I put this? So I'm really hoping that ecological services will become something that could be monetized down the road sooner rather than later. But I see from looking at what we've seen here of how landowners right now use timber harvest as a way to monetize their land and the forests that they have. So is there an inherent conflict there that if ecological services are provided because of habitat restoration and hydrological benefits and all those kinds of things, that then 30 years later you clear cut the forest and you start all over again? You know what I'm saying? I'm just wondering if those two ideas collide.
Well, I mean,
Can
I
you have
think,
both?
sure. I mean, I think that's why you have things like permanence, and that's why you have standards. I mean, the thing about forest carbon that makes it tricky is that, unlike other sort of carbon project types, is that there is this issue that it can be reversed, right? And it can be released, and that's why you have very robust standards around permanence and enforcement mechanisms around that. So, unless somebody is going to violate those contracts, then no. I mean, I think that's, ARB has a 100-year standard. So no. I mean, I think that it's just like farmers they produce crops both for commodities, and then they have a whole range of farm bill options for how they could rest cropland for habitat. Timber landowners could respond to the same stimulus. I would imagine that you don't. Yeah, the switching cost, I think, is just an economic metric. I mean, really, you're co-managing. You're always going to be, you're pretty much always, unless you have a very unique forest, you're always going to be co-managing for timber and for carbon and for habitat and for water, not to forget those two important items as well. So it's a spectrum of co-management. I don't think it's when I talk about switching price, I don't mean to give the impression that all of a sudden there's going to be this massive switch and there's going to be no more timber production. It's going to be it's a big continuum and a big spectrum, and I think that's part of the beauty of it, is being able to really manage a forest for its best intrinsic value, whether that be carbon or habitat or timber or a mix of those values. And different prices are going to create better and better behavior, better options along those lines for the public and for the private industry.
Jeremy Mannion with the Arbor Day Foundation. Just some general strategies we've been trying to think about working on is, there are land aggregators working to try to drive efficiencies on reforestation, on improved forest management, on the project development side. I think what we've been trying to think about with our corporate partners is, how do we start maybe aggregating whole industries into making investments across all these three different kinds of forest type, and help them start collaborating instead of competing, because this is all going to benefit them long-term economically as well, whether it's oil and gas or big tech or consumer brands. And so I know that's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of capitalism principles, but we're starting to see oil and gas and big tech catching on to this and seeing that they can all leverage their collective capital to start maybe making some of these addressing some of these economic issues that you've been talking about. And so we're doing what we can to try to convene that type of approach. And so if anyone wants to continue to talk about that, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, we are at time here, so I guess on that note, I'll thank our panelists for terrific presentations, and I thank you all for a great discussion and for coming, and hope to see you back here next year.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions.